welcome back to Pure EVil MMA. I got a special treat for us today to share some kind of nostalgic stories about Ken Shamrock as he was blossoming. And we have one of his close friends that was with him at the time of his early days. We have Rick Radosevich joining us here on Pure EVil MMA. How you doing today, Rick?
Doing great.
So, like I was saying, man, when was the first time you met Ken Shamrock? Because that's where it all starts.
Yeah, I was about 12 years old. I had just turned 13 and was sent to the Shamrock Ranch group home out of Susanville. And when I first got there, the first person I met and shook hands with was Ken Shamrock. Ken showed me around the house and all that, and then immediately after that, he wanted to start wrestling with me and really took a liking to me and took me under his wing. And so things started to blossom from there.
So where was Ken at that time? I mean, you said that, like, I was checking out your Twitter. This is how me and you got in touch. I actually was, on Twitter, and I saw that you're really close with Ken, and you guys were at the Shamrock Ranch group home for troubled boys. That's where you guys met?
Yes.
Okay, so you were about 12 years old at that time, you said?
Yeah, I was about 12, 13 years old when I met Ken at the Shamrock Ranch group home.
And where was Ken at that time? What year was that, roughly?
That was 1979.
Wow. So 1979, where was Ken Shamrock in that year? I mean, he was obviously wrestling in high school in his early days,
we were both just starting out as freshmen in high school, and Ken got me in. He was on the wrestling team and the football team.
Yeah.
And he got me involved playing football, and we were on the same wrestling team together, and so that kind of blossomed from there into a 4-year thing at the same high school for 4 years. That was Lassen High School out of Susanville, California.
So how many kids were actually in that school?
There was roughly 300 kids in that school. There was 300 kids, roughly, yeah, about that.
Did Ken stand out at that time like someone special to everybody?
Ken was very popular. A lot of athletes hung around with Ken. He was kind of like the number one guy at the school. He was known for his toughness and his
same swagger?
Yes.
So at that time, I mean, he was really good at football in high school. He was almost to get drafted to the Green Bay Packers. Did you see scouts coming out checking him out for both football and wrestling?
There were scouts there. I know that he had a offer to try out with the San Diego Chargers, I believe, when he was playing football for Shasta College. He played after high school. He had went to Shasta College and played 1 year with them, and had an offer to try out with the San Diego Chargers, and his thing was he was going to play pro football, and he could have very easily. He was very good at football, and he changed his mind at the last second and started doing all these tough man contests in town at the county fairs and going out of town and doing tough man
Which
contests.
is what, for people out there that aren't familiar with what a tough man contest is, what was it at the time?
It was a wrestling match, a real wrestling match where there's blood involved to see who the best, the winner is, who's the best at doing whatever it is at the time.
So basically no holds bars. I mean, the UFC wasn't in place at the time. We all know Ken Shamrock was in the first UFC event. So these are the early days.
Right.
So how was Ken doing amongst, those tough man competitions around there? And was he making a name for himself doing that as well?
He was making a good name for himself. I don't remember Ken losing any of those. As well as in high school, he never lost a wrestling match other than one time in high school. And Ken just didn't lose. He had this attitude that he was going to win, and there was no other way, and he was going to die trying to do it. He just had that ability to do that. He was a winner, and he didn't stand for losing at all.
So not only were you on the same wrestling team as him, but you were just saying that he got you into football. What position did both you guys play?
What was that?
Not only were you guys both on the wrestling team, but you just told us that he got you into football. So what
Right.
positions did you guys play?
I played nose guard, and then I was on a kickoff special receiving team. Ken was a running back. He played running back and middle linebacker.
Was he always like that big of a kid back then too? I mean, middle linebacker, you got to be at least what, like 205 pounds in high school to be a middle linebacker?
He weighed roughly, he wrestled at 185. He played football around 185 to 190 pounds.
What about the girls? Were the girls all about him in the early years, seeing all the swagger? He kind of sounds like the popular man in the entire town in the late 70s.
Right. Ken always had a girlfriend. She wasn't with one girl. Eventually, very shortly, he got into another relationship. When that one ended, he had another girlfriend. The girls were always around Ken and just thought he was the man.
Well, the reality of it is, no matter who it is, there's always somebody doubting people, especially in the early years of high school. I remember, like, adults, like, setting it into our heads when we were on the football team, like, you're not going to be able to make a career out of this. You need to stick to your school books. Like, they kind of crush your hopes and dreams. So were there any people doubting Ken Shamrock in the early years?
Was there any what? I'm sorry.
Was there anybody that was doubting Ken Shamrock amongst the town or people at the boys' home?
You know, there was always one or two people, not at the group home, but they were just in the town alone that thought he would never make it. As a wrestler, as a pro football player, or any of that. There was one or two guys that just thought they were tougher than Ken, and Ken's was always offering them to come and have a fighting match, a real fighting match, to see who was going to win. And you know, he declared that he was the toughest in Susanville as a freshman or a sophomore in high school. He declared that he was the toughest in town, that nobody can beat him. Wrestling or fighting or any of that, no holds barred type of thing.
So we were just talking about like going to the fairs and doing the tough man competitions, and this was before the UFC. Now, how did he stumble upon the UFC? Do you know that story of, you know, how he became part of that legendary UFC 1?
You know, that's where Ken and I kind of split up at. We were roommates after the group home. We were roommates at 18 years old when Ken started bar bouncing.
Okay, so
he went his own way. I went my own way. And as far as I know, that he got into pro wrestling and was a pro wrestler before any of the UFC or pancreas fights or any of that.
So let's start there. You guys are both 18 years old. You're in this house. This is after high school. He's a bouncer. What are you doing at the time?
I was in the restaurant business. So I was a cook.
So you guys probably had some wild nights. 18 years old. Ken's the talk of the town, and he's the bouncer as well. So he's obviously getting all the girls. Do you have any stories of, you know, rooming with Ken Shamrock?
He was getting all the girls. He always had a girl coming home with him from the bar every night that he worked, and he was only 19 years old, working in a place that required you to be 21. And so yeah, Ken was coming home with at least one or two girls, and we were both buff at the time, you know, a lot of muscle showing. We worked out get a gym from the time I got to the group home until Ken and I split up as roommates, and he went his way, I kind of went my way, and that's where things kind of ended at. But as far as him getting into the UFC, all that, he was a pro wrestler long before the UFC and the pancreas fighting.
So when you guys were 18 years old, there was no WWF either, correct? Those were the real early days.
There was WWF. In fact, it was on TV every day, and that's all Ken watched in the group home with the WWF. And he used to tell me, he'd get me on the ground when the WWF was going in the living room on the floor in the living room.
Romperhausen.
Group home. And he would whisper in my ear and tell me, excuse me, I'm going to be world champion someday on TV. I'm going to be on that WWF, and I'm going to be the best, and no one's going to be able to beat me. He used to just tell me all the time that he was going to be on the WWF, and it comes out to be that he was.
I mean, I have Ken Shamrock action figures, and I mean, going back as far as I can remember, he's kind of the gateway into, kind of how I stumbled on to MMA, because was Ken Shamrock. He was the guy that did both of them when I was in, elementary school, middle school, in the, mid-90s. So he was blowing up with the Hulk Hogan's and all that, but there were no real big stars around then, but Andre the Giant was around, right? In like the 80s, late 70s, 80s, right? Is this about the time you guys are 18?
Right. Yeah, about 70, about 82, 83, because I turned 18 in 1983 and graduated. Ken graduated in 1982.
And wrestling blew up. Wrestling blew up in the 80s. I mean, I've interviewed one of the girls from Glow. There was the Gorgeous Ladies of Wrestling. I mean, everyone was watching wrestling in the 80s. It really blew up.
Right. It was the thing in the 80s. Wrestling was, even in high school, it was big. It was really huge in high school and college, and it was big.
So once you guys parted ways and you heard that he was becoming world champion and stuff, like, were you kind of set back, or was it really all expected? It was kind of like his destiny, and correct?
I expected Ken to, once I heard he was, I was at work on the job, and I had heard that he beat some guy in the UFC, and that's how I actually found out about UFC 1 and started watching it from that point. And it didn't surprise me at all that Ken was a UFC champion at all. I wasn't surprised because of his, he was a really good athlete, and his determination of he's going to win and he's not going to lose type of persona was his skill set and everything was there, that it didn't surprise me that he was a UFC champion.
And
I wanted to get on the phone and call him and, say, hey, nice job, but back then it was kind of
difficult.
Chasing my tail, around trying to get a hold of Ken.
Yeah. Well, you know what? That's the thing that really separates a good athlete from a champion, is where their head's at. And Ken Shamrock's kind of like the original swagger. Like, the way that he was, like, I've watched the way that he trains and works out, and it's pretty brutal. I mean, he really puts himself to the brink when he, like, works out.
Right.
He really tests his limits. So what was the last time that you actually did come in contact with Ken after all these years?
I seen Ken. I talked to him on the phone when he was in pro wrestling. I'd seen Bob Shamrock, his dad, at a Burger King restaurant in Susanville, and he gave me Ken's number, and I'm like, are you sure it's okay to call? Because he was pretty popular with pro wrestling then, and so I gave him a call up on the phone, and he was glad to hear from me. But yeah,
I mean, his father, especially, wasn't his father in his corner a lot too? His father was a big part in his success, correct?
Bob Shamrock was his manager for a long time,
Yeah.
in the corner, in the ring, and the towel man, and you name it. He was Ken's manager for a very long time.
And now Ken's still in the game with his son. His son's actually fighting in Shamrock FC and making a pretty good name for himself. I mean, he's really learning down there, and Ken Shamrock has really been a staple in not only MMA, not only in my life, but in so many people's lives around him. It sounds like. So if you could sum up your relationship with Ken growing up, like watching him, you know, how could you really sum it up all in a nutshell? Who was Ken Shamrock as a kid?
Ken Shamrock was hard to explain. He was this nice guy, but he wanted respect, and if he didn't get the respect that was deserved or showed, then he took it.
So he was always like that. He was always like that, huh?
He was always like that from growing up at 9, 10 years old when he was doing strong arm robberies and out being a thief and a thug and stealing from people. He was always like that, with that respect thing. If you disrespected him, then it was on.
Rick, I want to thank you so much for joining us here on Pure EVil MMA and kind of reminiscing because, like I said, Ken Shamrock is such a staple in MMA and in wrestling. I got his dolls. I mean, huge gateway to so many people for MMA and wrestling. So it's really awesome to have you come on the show and let us know what he was like growing up, because I have a lot of young listeners. And like I was saying early on, a lot of people doubt everyone. Like, everyone has a doubter, and it can really crush your dreams. But if you look at somebody like Ken Shamrock and you see how mentally strong he is, you look at somebody like Conor McGregor, see how mentally strong he is. I think that's something that they don't teach in school. So if there's something that we take from Ken Shamrock, it's confidence.
He was mentally strong with what he was going to do, and picking to be a fighter over being a professional football player where there's way more money. He picked fighting, and that was his dream. He was going to be the best at it, and he's made that pretty clear that he was the best at it.
You know, why was that? Do you know, why didn't he follow up in football or wrestling? Oh, he did follow up in wrestling, excuse me. Why didn't he follow up in football?
Why didn't he follow up in football?
Yeah.
That's a very good question that's unanswered still, that I'd even like to ask him why he didn't follow up and go and do the tryout with the San Diego Chargers, and why he picked pro wrestling instead. Ken just has this thing in his brain that it's a challenge to him, that he's going to beat this challenge. And I just think that being a pro wrestler, or him even thinking about being a fighter at the time and how all that fell together was another story. But he just had this thing about him that he's a winner and there's no one else that's better than him, and he's the best, and that's as good as it gets. He just had that thing about him that he just went in to be a pro wrestler and a professional fighter, and that's where I don't understand, because the money was in football at the time, and why he didn't pick football. Why he picked pro wrestling and being a professional fighter over football. I do not know that question.
It's funny that he did, though, and things would be a lot different. Like they say, the butterfly effect. The MMA could be a lot different now. There could be a lot of people that don't know about MMA if there was no Ken Shamrock. You know, so it's just funny how things work out. Rick, thank you so much. Last but not least, where can everybody find you on social media?
You're welcome.
Where can everybody find you on social media, like Twitter?
On Twitter's about it. That's all I have is Twitter.
Okay, what's your tag on there?
At Radosevich Rick.
and I'll link that below in the description. Rick, thank you so much. Have a blessed day.
Sure, Eddie. You too, and God bless you.
God bless.